Welcome back to the Regenerative Health Podcast. I'm joined today by Peter Cowan. Now, Peter is a software engineer, he's a health coach and EMF mitigator, and he's the author of an extremely viral Substack article titled, "Could Chronic EMF Exposure from a Nearby Substation Be Causing the 49ers Epidemic of ACL Injuries?" So, Peter, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Max.
Give us a background about this whole viral article, because as we were talking off air, everyone seems to have been surprised by what actually the impact that this has had.
Yeah, I'm probably the most surprised, honestly. I earlier, about last September, I decided I was going to really focus on developing some software that I've just been working on for a couple of years. And AI has gotten really good. So I'll do some prompts and then I'll have 5 to 10 minutes of waiting. And I had been doing a lot of scrolling on social media and I don't want to do that. So I decided I would dig into some of my long form writing. And I had seen a clip of John Feliciano, who's an ex 49er on a local Bay Area radio station, joking about the substation being the cause of their injuries, because everybody wants to know, why are the 49ers so injured, like in the sports world? And so I heard that. And then what I really heard, though, is after he made that joke, he said, there's some very high level players in the organization who take this seriously. He's like, they're like the crunchy Bay Area granola types, and they're like really concerned about their health. And it's like, maybe it causes some issue with the thyroid or something. And I heard him. And what I heard there was like, players are concerned and nobody's listening to them. And I do client work, and something that I really believe strongly is that people tend to kind of know what's causing their issues at like an instinctive, like gut level. And so I thought, nobody's listening to them, I'm going to take them seriously. And I started, and it happened to align with some research I'd already been doing. I just started writing it. And then I happened to be going down to the Bay Area to visit my family for Thanksgiving. And on the way back to the airport, I stopped at the stadium with my dad, and we had like maybe 10 minutes there. And I looked for a place where I could measure. There's guards everywhere. And I thought, I'm just going to get under the field right here. I took my video and we left and spent another month writing the article. And I told a colleague, I hit some colleagues up, say, hey, I'm going to start a Substack. Maybe I can get them to recommend it and maybe get like 10 subscribers or something. And I had a buddy in the Bay, and we do this friends Thanksgiving every year. And he's like, we know the owners of the 49ers, and like, maybe, this is interesting. Maybe I could get a meeting with them. So I thought, maybe I'll get like 10 to 30,000 views and like just enough exposure that I can maybe get that meeting and like help the players out, because honestly, that's what my interest was. And then, as always goes with the things, I posted it. I shut my computer for 24 hours because I was hanging with my girls we were celebrating a late Christmas because they had been with their mom. And then I opened up my computer the next day, and it's like every hour it was increasing by 500,000 views. And I'm just like, what the hell is happening? So that's how this all started.
To talk about your thesis, because and give some background to the sport, because it's my understanding that, or at least as detailed in your article, that this team in San Francisco, NFL team, have a significantly above average injury rate.
Yeah. And so, I grew up in the Bay. I'm a Niners fan, but I'm not like a hardcore football watcher. So it wasn't really on my radar until I heard John Feliciano mention it. And so I started looking into it, and there's a big world, the whole world of like fantasy football and now sports gambling. They're really concerned about this issue because it affects them in a very concrete way. And there's a writer named Aaron Schatz who's really dug into this. And they came up with a study called AGL, and it means Adjusted Games Lost. And it's a way to look at the impact of the injuries. So it's not just who's on the roster and who's not. They could be questionable, doubtful. And there's different statuses, and it depends on how important that player is to the team, and so on and so forth. And as far as the Niners go, they're just like they're in the bottom. I think I always get it backwards. They're in the bottom of those rankings like for almost every year since they moved to the Levi Stadium.
And I'm guessing that metric encompasses the severity of the injury. So
For sure.
a torn Achilles or a ruptured
Yes,
ACL is going to take you out for a very long time.
exactly. And in doing that research, I realized that so many of these injuries that we're seeing are soft tissue injuries and many of them non-contact. And I had watched the Super Bowl in 2024, I think it was, and Dre Greenlaw was running from the sidelines in just sub in for another player, and he tore his Achilles just running in from the sidelines, and it just didn't seem right. I like I said, I grew up watching football in the early '80s, and just like standards were way different than the technology we had, the nutrition, everything not as good, and you weren't seeing this rash of soft tissue non-contact injuries.
You to rupture an Achilles tendon, that is a very very significant injury. And here in Australia, it can sometimes happen to say netball players, but it's like biology has built an extremely robust piece of soft tissue to in order to deal with the amount of force that's supposed to go through that. So I mean, and there's certain conditions. Maybe we can talk about this. Fluoroquinolone antibiotic use is a really big one in terms of
Mm-hmm.
predisposing you to an Achilles rupture. But yeah, there has to be some pretty deranged physiology or some insane amount of force to actually rupture an Achilles tendon.
I mean, I have a good example in real life. I was playing basketball with a friend who had a history of Achilles issues in his life, but never a tear. And I jumped up to grab the ball and I landed on his Achilles as it was like hyper flexed. So most of my weight landing directly on it from a pretty high jump. And that snapped his Achilles tendon. But that was like a direct high impact injury on someone with a history of issues.
So let's launch into the actual thesis here and
Okay.
what you've detailed. I guess a summary. I would obviously encourage everyone to go and read the series. It's not long and it's very well written and accessible. But explain what you think is going on here to connect the presence of an electrical substation and this NFL football stadium to the injury rate.
Yeah. So I mean, like you said, there's a lot in there, and but I think just from a very high level, it's mitochondrial dysfunction, and it's causing so mitochondria produce energy, ATP, and they produce radical oxygen species, and they produce water, and when you disrupt the mitochondria, they produce more radical oxygen species and less water, and so at a very high level, I'm seeing dehydration at the cellular level, and collagen is roughly 99.6% water by molecule count, and it's an important part of the structure of the collagen. And so, just at the very simplest level, if you're disrupting mitochondrial function and to the point where you're getting dehydrated at a cellular level, collagen structure is going to be impacted.
I actually want to walk people through that and maybe medical colleagues who maybe in their pre-entry courses did a bit of mitochondrial physiology, but
Okay.
definitely wouldn't have remembered, which is this idea that the mitochondria make water. And so to be extremely abundantly clear about this idea of cellular dehydration, what Peter's referring to is that the a byproduct of mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation, of essentially physiology, exhaust, whatever you want to call it, is going to be water, and it's made and carbon dioxide, which is made at the fourth complex of the electron transport chain. So the electrons tunnel through the complexes, protons get pumped out across the membrane to create this gradient, proton gradient, and then oxygen comes in at cytochrome C, and it accepts that electron, and it forms water, H2O. So, and I think a lot of people and we can talk about this as well, who have been criticizing you, and some with the MD qualification after their name. I don't think they have even made that connection in their head about the point that you're making with respect to this point.
I think, yeah, and I think to be fair to them, like they're trained differently, and it was, I don't think oxidative stress was necessarily even in the what they learned in medical school until more recently. So people don't know what they don't know, and I can't blame them for that. And partially why I wrote that is just like there's a lot more information here, and these are known. Like oxidative stress is a known mechanism.
Yeah, and
Very. Yeah, go ahead.
and I think the dehydration aspect of it is huge.
It's
I
huge.
happened to when I read the piece, and to me that felt really one of the, it felt correct. It felt mechanistically plausible, and this idea that if we're bathing in a soup of non-native magnetic field, and that is negatively affecting mitochondrial physiology, one of the most, I guess, robust or plausible mechanisms would be that the the mitochondrion isn't, or the mitochondrial colony in general, because we really need to be specific here. It's not
Yeah.
just about one mitochondrion in one
Yeah.
fibroblast or one myocyte. It's the entire colony of mitochondria in the entire body are going to have their energy output reduced, and potentially water production reduced, if they're in a field that's non-native to them.
Right. And I think it's worth pointing out, just because we're talking about, a lot of your colleagues in this field, is that even if you are educated in how the mitochondria works, you are taught that water is a byproduct. And just the traditional science is, oh yeah, it's just a byproduct. Whereas, when we get into this more quantum biology perspective and biophysics, water is a structural element and plays a key role in the transport of electrons throughout the body. And I specifically avoided talking about that too much in my essays because, there's so much that we just don't know. And I wanted to be able to talk to people in the language that they would be more likely to know. But so if you're from that world and you're like, water's a byproduct, it doesn't matter. Like, yeah, it's not, this thesis is kind of just going to be like an eye roll to you, maybe.
Yeah, and the reality is that it's hydrating these proteins. It is
Yep.
it, it was described as the meat, the stage, and the actors. I mean, it's everything that is going on, all the biochemical reactions and the biophysical reactions that allow life are doing so on the background of water and in an aqueous environment.
Right. I mean, like my Twitter tag is sunlight is life, but honestly, I kind of feel like water is life.
The Guy Foundation, who I've been doing a bit of collaborative work with, who are a philanthropic institution dedicated to research in quantum biology, they
Mhm.
recently finished their autumn series on light, and prior to that it was water, and the next series they're going to do is on magnetobiology and magnetism. So
Perfect. That's
so
perfect.
so again, it's to head off initial thoughts about pseudoscience or woo woo. The leading researchers in the life sciences in the world are researching these three fundamental inputs into biology, and I think the reason why they're so fundamental is because of how they influence mitochondrial physiology, and how
Mhm.
much of health comes back to mitochondrial health and mitochondrial operating properly.
And it's kind of a paradigm shift that we're going through right now, and we're at the leading edge of it. And it's new to a lot of people, especially if you're in day-to-day practice and you're doing, clinical work. You're not reading all the brand new research. And the Guy Foundation is one example. I've read their book. It's amazing. I would highly recommend. I don't remember what it's called, but it's really, really fascinating.
Yeah,
You have it right
it's
there.
yeah. I got
Nice.
Professor
Yep.
Guy sent me a
Yep.
copy. It's called
Yep.
Quantum Biology and the Glimpse into the Future of Medicine. So
And yeah, it's hard science, and just like understanding how things work at the quantum level is a different way of, it'll kind of break your mind a little bit, but it's very fascinating.
yeah, and underlying this research area is this thought that biochemistry is inadequate to explain the
Right.
speed and the complexity of how the cell and life interacts. And there's got to be um, aspect to this that is that's using light to communicate, that is using quantum mechanical processes. So
Yep.
let's talk about this idea of non-native EMF, because
Right.
off the bat, people are that might have triggered some of the calls that people have said that this is, potentially a conspiracy theory. So explain to us about EMF, non-native EMF, and these basic components.
Yeah, I like to just start real simple. And like most people don't know what EMF is. They don't know what electromagnetism is. Some like the guy that first started this controversy online referred to EMF as the electromotive force. Like it's just not something most people know about. Chase Senior, I got to call him out. He's a great guy. So I like to just point out that when it's been raining and then the sun comes out, you see a rainbow, and it breaks out into the seven colors, and red is the biggest one, and then down at the bottom is violet, and they'll kind of bend at different rates. That's because they're different wavelengths and they have different strengths and different lengths of the wave. So light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. It's a very small, it's, I can't go too far, but it's very tiny. There's something like 71 octaves of electromagnetism. So on the UV side of light, we get into something called ionizing radiation, which is radiation that can physically knock an electron out of an atom. And that's where you get things like X-rays and gamma rays, and everybody knows those are harmful. You go to the doctor to get an X-ray, and they put the big lead apron over you. It's heavy, and they're just like, well, for some reason, it's okay to blast one part of your body with the radiation, but not the rest. But but on the other end, outside of visible light, you get infrared, and all the way down to something called the Schumann resonance, and that is lower energy electromagnetic radiation that is not ionizing. It cannot knock an electron out of anything. And people experience infrared. You experience it as heat because it causes vibrations in the molecules in your body. But anything below that is kind of just like it's invisible. Unless you're hypersensitive, you can't feel it. And historically, it's been the common narrative has been that unless it creates a thermal effect, as in unless it's strong enough to physically heat your tissues, it's not going to cause any health issues. And within that whole spectrum is things like AM radio, FM radio, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, microwaves, millimeter waves, all the way on up to infrared.
Yeah, a great explanation, and I think I'd color that by making it clear that the human body essentially evolved with quite a specific signature of electromagnetic radiation. I think that's really clear. And what that means is the life on Earth was shaped by the presence of an absence of certain wavelengths of electromagnetic energy. And I think, as you mentioned, visible light between 400 nanometers and 760, 780 is what is potentially what we can see. But really, that whole spectrum from 280 nanometers, which is UVB, and below UVB, it gets cut off by atmospheric ozone.
Mm-hmm.
Probably a good thing, prevents us from really high energy light hitting us. And then projecting all the way beyond 2,500, 3,000 nanometers in the infrared. That is our like native electromagnetic signature. And I think, and that's what the adaptations that our biology and our mitochondria have made to deal with. But what you're describing, and sure, and the Schumann resonance as well is a native EMF. But what you're describing in all the radio range is that these are wavelengths or areas of the electromagnetic spectrum that we have co-opted for our technological and communicative use, and that they weren't present prior to the development of the electricity grid.
Basically, yeah. I think when the telegraph arrived in the mid 1800s was the first time we were exposed to a non-native. And I also think that it's interesting to note that even though that all those things you mentioned are basically the electromagnetic radiation that we evolved with, there are times, when just from natural cycles with the sun and so on, that we are exposed, the conditions kind of change. And you do get some radio waves coming through the atmosphere, and when the sun is really hyperactive, you'll get more like high energy stuff coming through the atmosphere. And so there's phenomenon throughout human history of health effects from these external space, let's call it space weather effects. People have been sensitive, like they call it meteorological sensitivity. And there's correlations, some people believe, between solar cycles and pandemics and comets and pandemics. So there's other forms of non-native EMF basically that we've been exposed to. But in the past almost 200 years, we've really ratcheted up by creating technology that is now basically omnipresent. We've really ratcheted it up so it's always with us.
The key point that you mentioned, that Peter mentioned, is that the assumption of regulatory bodies, governments, is that this energy beyond infrared, this non-ionizing radiation, is essentially shows absence of human harm, as long as it's not at intensities too sufficient to heat the tissue. And I think that is the key. That's the crux of the issue. That's how our modern telecommunications-based society can function. Because if we did, or if the regulations reflected at least what the animal data talks about in terms of RF radiation and potentially magnetic field radiation as well from the power grid, then I think that would severely hamper the progression and expansion of communication. So I think I just want to say that as a prefacing comment before we dive in deeper, because someone will say, all right, if it's so harmful, why is it not banned?
Yeah. And also, that's, just to be fair too, like when they came up with those standards, it was because radar operators were getting burnt by radar. And we didn't have as much knowledge about the mitochondria and oxidative stress and stuff. So it doesn't even have to be some big thing. Sometimes standards get set and they get locked in place. And then institutional inertia and economic factors mean it's going to be really difficult to change those without disrupting the status quo. And status quo is a very powerful force.
Absolutely. We won't talk a lot about radio frequency. I think that can be a discussion for another time. Sure. But let's talk specifically about these magnetic fields. And maybe I wanted to also preface this conversation with the statement that magnetic fields influence biology. I think that's a really key flag in the sand here, because and there's a bunch of studies that we know about that, and maybe I'll give a quick overview, which is hypomagnetism, and this is being studied in the case of astronauts, and potentially what happens when we go beyond Earth's magnetic field to Mars, Moon, whatever. And it seems pretty compelling from a range of research that when you remove the organism, the human cell, the human body from a magnetic field, the native magnetic field, it suffers, and it suffers badly. So although people don't realize it, they can drink water, they can get sunlight and see that those are necessary. They probably can't feel a magnetic field, but I just wanted to make the point here that it's an undisputed medical and scientific fact that magnetism is key for human existence.
Absolutely. I think that one of my favorite studies about magnetism and human existence comes from a doctor named Rutger Weaver that did he basically built these underground bunkers. And correct me if I'm wrong, one was a Faraday cage that blocked out the electrical signals, and the other one used something called mu metal. I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's big, like a nickel iron alloy that can block magnetic fields. And he let the subjects in there, they give them artificial light so they could kind of turn the lights on and off as their circadian rhythm adjusted to the new environments. and he found that in the basic Faraday cage room, that the their sleep wake cycle kind of drifted to 25 hours or so. But if they introduced a 10 hertz wave, which is similar to that Schumann resonance that we were talking about, it would bring them back closer to the 24-hour window. But in the mu metal cage, it was completely blocked from the magnetic fields. They drifted. I don't remember. I think it was above 30 hours. Some people even to 50 hours, I think. And I don't actually remember the details beyond that, but the turns out that the magnetic field has a significant effect on just all of our processes.
Yeah, it's an area of active research, and I think it's key to or part of the development of the exploration of quantum biology. And initially, I believe it was the discussion or discovery of magnetoreception in I think it was a European swallow, and they realized that the European robin, they're able to navigate based on magnetism, and the mechanisms here probably related to electron spin and some magnetochemistry going on, and how potentially the organism is sensing these magnetic fields through the effect on electron spin. But the crux here is that we are very sensitive to magnetic fields, and particularly their absence. So what about the presence of a non-native magnetic field? And maybe you can give us some units so we can essentially understand the magnitudes here.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'm so bad with units, but I did write them down because I got two different tools that I use, and one measures in one unit and one measures the other. And I'm always just, but specifically for, you wanted to focus on magnetic fields in the United States. I think the cutoff is 2,000 milligauss, at which point it's considered harmful. However, in Russia, which I use as a comparison just because Russia, historically, their scientists had looked at the effects of this stuff at a very different level, at like seeing immune effects even back in like the 40s and 50s. Their cutoff is, let's see, looks like I didn't write it down. Oh yeah, 50 to 100 milligauss. And so the numbers that we're seeing, though, like a typical background exposure at someone's house is 0.5 milligauss. And then it'll go up to like, 20 if you're under some very high voltage power lines, maybe even higher if they're like a very key like feeder line or something. But you typically don't see much above that in a normal residential area.
Yeah, I've got some figures here, and this is thanks to Tristan Scott, who wrote a really great backup piece to your pieces on Substack. And he's made the point that the US actually has the highest limits for EMF exposure and compared to other countries. So Sweden and the Netherlands, they have 4 milligauss limit for new construction of schools, daycares, and playgrounds. Okay. Interesting. Israel, 4 milligauss should be the limit for continued and prolonged exposure, and again 4 milligauss for new construction for sensitive locations. Russia 50 milligauss, Italy 30, Switzerland 10 milligauss for sensitive places, and New York State 200 milligauss right-of-way limit for power lines. So okay, those are the limits that have been set here. What are we dealing with, say, from the natural background radiation? Are you across those numbers?
For the Earth?
Yeah.
I think, it depends on where you are latitude-wise, but it averages roughly 0.5 Gauss, so 500 milligauss.
Yeah.
And if you're closer to the equator, it's like 0.35. And if it's at the poles, I think it's 0.65.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to make a distinction about that magnetic field. It's qualitatively very different than the magnetic fields that are emanating from our electric infrastructure. So our infrastructure is AC, alternating current. So you're getting this sine wave and it's flipping polarity. In the United States, it's 60 hertz, so that's 60 times a second. Most of the rest of the world is 50 hertz, 50 times a second. And then let's say you have like a refrigerator magnet. I don't actually know the Gauss on a refrigerator magnet. It's pretty strong, but it's a static field, and you have the positive side and the negative side. And if you ever wind up at like some hippie wellness fair, like there'll be like somebody selling you magnet therapy. I've, you know, it's an interesting thing I haven't looked too much into, but there's still a difference between a refrigerator magnet and the Earth's magnetic field, because in the Earth, the field comes out of the South Pole and goes up to the North Pole and goes back in. And so depending where you are on the planet, the so let's say you're at the equator, it's basically the field is going straight up and down, but at the poles, it's almost completely horizontal to the Earth, and then it moves in between, and the strength goes in between, and it's only one direction. So if you're in the South Pole, it's coming out, and if you're in the North Pole, it's going back in. So it's just not qualitatively comparable at all to AC magnetic fields.
Yeah, and that's the point I was alluding to, which is simply measuring intensity is not sufficient to delineate or separate a native from a non-native
Yep.
field, and we can't say just because the field coming out of the on the 49ers field is less than the background Earth's magnetic field that it's somehow benign or not biologically significant. The other point I think is worth making is that the actual evidence for some of this EMF exposure is actually in cancer. And again, Tristan really has explained that really nicely. But it's saying Albaum et al. 2000, which seems to be potentially a systematic review, showed that for children exposed to average fields greater than 4 milligauss, there was a relative risk of exactly 2 with respect to leukemia.
Mm-hmm.
And Greenland et al. 2015 studies for children exposed to average fields greater than 3 milligauss, relative risk is of leukemia is 1.7. So interesting studies or scientific research in humans showing a negative health effect.
Yeah, when you were telling me the different standards in the countries, that 4 milligauss really stood out to me, because I'm aware of 3 milligauss really being the threshold from the research that I'd been familiar with, where childhood leukemia really starts to pop up. And a ton of research was done on this in the 70s when the big power lines were going through, because we were upgrading our infrastructure in the United States. But it seems to have been memory hold.
So talk now about, again, like what is talk about the actual substation, its proximity to the stadium, and what type of measurements you were getting when you walked there yourself.
Yeah, so I do want to be clear about that. I was not actually able to get super close to the facilities. It's kind of tucked in right behind the actual stadium. There's the facilities, and then there's 2 roads that go either direction. And so I was a good football field length away from the facilities. And I think the readings that I was getting were likely from either an overhead line or an underground feeder, which I measured some underground feeders around there that were, when I was standing over them, I was getting between 20 and 30 milligauss at like waist level. Down right above the field it was above 50. I don't remember what it was, but it was clear that was from a feeder. So I didn't want to get that field. But there's no way for me to know exactly what the reading would be at the facilities from the substation itself. I do know that it is the largest substation in Silicon Valley Power, and it was created to serve the stadium, but also a growing number of data centers, because this is Silicon Valley and it's kind of the center of where a lot of these tech companies build their data centers. It has 3 massive 50 mega ampere transformers. I think I got the unit right. Forgive me if I'm wrong. And it's got these big bushings as well. And both of those things are prominent sources for the magnetic field. And I believe, it's my understanding, that the bushings, the way that they're constructed, make it so that the field doesn't get weaker as fast as it might otherwise. So based on the estimates that I did and what I've heard from people who have claimed that they've got a Gauss meter in there, is that I measured roughly 9 milligauss, just a hair under 9 milligauss. They said they were seeing readings about 4 times higher, up to 36. When I did my estimates, I cut it off at 21 for a typical exposure because I was trying to be conservative. But again, there's no way we can know for sure until somebody in there says, okay, we did a reading and it's this high.
Mm. Yeah, I saw a tweet from someone called Lightwork Home Health.
Yeah.
And they look like EMF building biologists who did some measurements and got between 4.7 to 22 milligauss. And again, that's outside the facility. So would be very interesting, as you say, to get some readings from inside the stadium.
Yeah. Well, particularly the facilities though, because that's right up against the substation. The stadium itself is a little bit farther.
Mm. So I guess we're like, to recap of where we're at the moment. We're observing, or that there's an observed massive or disproportionate increase in non-contact, unprovoked soft tissue injuries in this team. There's this huge electrical substation nearby. We have a hypothesis which I think is holds water and holds water, that potentially mitochondrial dysfunction and reduced mitochondrial water production is contributing to cellular dysfunction and potentially weakening these key connective tissues that's manifest because the players are exposed essentially continuously during their working day to these non-native magnetic fields emanating from the substation. So, and to be clear, we talked about the evidence behind childhood leukemia, but up till now, there hasn't been any longer or larger research specifically about soft tissue injuries.
Yep. And to the extent that there is any scientific literature on a direct connection, it's the effect of, I think it's like 2,000 milligauss on fibroblasts. So, you know, that's why I really focused more on the theoretical mechanisms. And there's a lot of indirect evidence, evidence that EMFs cause oxidative stress, evidence that oxidative stress causes issues with collagen. But yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can expand a little bit more on the theory that or the proposed mechanism, because I think that's a real strength of your subtext series. And what you mentioned was in your article was this difference, I guess, between a potential the endogenous electromagnetic field that's actually being generated as a byproduct of electron transport compared to an external field, which is obviously coming from the power grid. Yeah,
and I think to me that's kind of the key piece. If you don't read anything else, it comes from a study by a specialist in electromagnetic radiation and its effect on human health from Canada named Paul Heroux. And he wrote a review, or I don't know if it's a study or a review, but back in 2025 about wireless and its effects on biology. And he took it down to the just very basic principles of physics. And as you mentioned, when the electrons are going across that inner mitochondrial membrane, they're generating their own electromagnetic field. And I don't know, it's like negative 140 millivolts or something like that. It's not very strong. But Paul Heroux pointed out that when you overlay one electromagnetic field on another one, there was a physicist in the 1800s, Maxwell. He had the four principles of electromagnetism, something like the four laws of electromagnetism. One of them is the principle of superposition. So when you overlay one on another, they alter each other. And so the way I like to kind of visualize it is, let's say you dropped a pebble in a pond and you got these tiny little ripples, and then a boat comes by far away and you get these big waves coming through. It's going to change the smaller waves, and like when you're at the bottom of the wave, they're going to get compressed, and when you're at the top of the wave, it's going to get expanded. And so that will pull some of the electrons off of that inner mitochondrial membrane and lead to more reactive oxygen species and less water. And I think the most important point that I did not really emphasize in my piece, unfortunately, is that it's not so much the strength of that external field as it is the change. So if you're in an environment that has, let's say it has, and it's not to discount strength in general, but people like to focus on the strength argument because they're, for all the reasons we already talked about. If you're in an environment that's at, let's say, 0.5 milligauss, and you move into an environment that's at 25, then that's a big shift. And that just the shift itself, regardless of strength, is going to cause problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And to me, it seems, I think it's relevant to make the point that when we talked about like the duration of exposure and the temporary nature of exposures, because obviously people, again, to give a medical analogy or reference point, is when you hop into a MRI machine, the way that device is able to image your tissues, your inside of your body, is by essentially spinning a huge magnet around you, creating a very, very strong magnetic field, and then using pulses of RF to essentially capture images, and it's based on some complex physics that's not really relevant to this. But yeah, the point is, that is a very temporary exposure. You're in an MRI machine for maybe 40 minutes. You're not under 15 million milligauss, whatever, 1.5 Tesla machine, depending on how advanced the the MRI machine is. You're not in that for the whole of your day. And I think the key point here with respect to the 49ers and these injuries is that it's like they're bathing in this. They're going into an environment of higher background non-native magnetic fields like every single day of their working life. These guys are professionals, that's their occupation. So whereas the human organism is extremely efficient or capable of dealing with intermittent stresses, the issue here, and I think it reflects the issue with EMF exposure in general, is the unrelenting nature of the exposure that essentially renders a hormetic response essentially there's no hormesis happening here. Yeah. There's just essentially chronic cell danger response and HPA activation, yep, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activation. I think that's a pretty important point.
I think it's a hugely important point, and that's why I put chronic exposure in the headline of my tweet that 22 million people saw, and I'd say only like 1% of them remembered the chronic part, and that's just how social media works. It's a very important part of this argument.
Yeah, maybe talk a little bit about the mitochondrion as an environmental sensor, because I think that's also relevant to this, which is they're not only there to transform food substrate into ATP. There's actually a lot more to the mitochondria than simply that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Traditionally, we're taught that basically food are converted into electrons and then are just transported, added to the electron transport chain, et cetera, et cetera. And turns out that light is a huge factor in charging our mitochondria, and infrared light in particular, and then blue light in particular, especially when isolated, is known to damage the respiratory proteins and degrade mitochondrial function. And so, the body is an electrical system, and there's certain mechanisms that are sensitive to like different frequencies and stuff. And I talk about like the voltage gated calcium channels and so on and so forth. Like this is not controversial information, but we're still kind of learning how it really affects us at a systemic level and what it all means. So it's not really an issue if we know everything here. It's like, wow, this is a whole new field and we're really starting to learn more about it. And why not look deeper?
Yeah, no, it's very, very, it's at least worth looking into, I think, rather than dismissing out of hand. which it seems like some have been interested in doing. Maybe we can take a step back from the mechanisms, because I mean we've discussed a lot. Maybe a lot of people listening to this, that's a little bit advanced for them anyway, but enough for people to start their investigations. But if we take a step back and think a bit more about the environment that the players are in. So sure that we're implying or suggesting that being in this facility and being exposed to this magnetic field is not ideal, but like what else is happening in the modern athlete's environment that could
Yeah.
potentially be impacting healing?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I actually think that circadian disruption is a bigger factor overall. And I think that the EMF from the substation is likely kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back for the 49ers, because you're seeing these soft tissue injuries across the league, across all professional sports. And I haven't looked into college and high school, so I can't answer that question, but I'd be surprised if you weren't seeing it there. And we don't have to dig too much into that mechanism if you don't want to, but I would just encourage anyone to look at the third article in my series. It's non-controversial circadian mechanisms showing exactly how collagen synthesis and repair is based on timing mechanisms based on our light exposure. And these football players, they're when they're not playing games, they're working out indoors under artificial light, and they're staying up watching film reels, analyzing plays when it's dark out, and then they're traveling across multiple time zones every week, practically every week, and then they're playing these games outside with this massive bright lights on them, and then so that's the circadian stuff, I think. And you can actually see that a lot of players are now starting to use blue blockers, and I've heard that some teams even have like a wind down twilight protocol. Haven't seen actual documented evidence of it, but I wouldn't be surprised. This stuff is not really that cutting edge anymore. It's coming very mainstream. So I think that alone is enough to be causing these issues. But then beyond that, let's look at the other things that they're subject to. And we should say, I know you don't want to get too much into RF, but the density of cell towers especially in a place like Silicon Valley has increased massively since 2014. And I will be doing a follow-up where I look at that and so people can see it, but let's skip over that for now. I think the biggest criticism I get from sports fans are like, it's the turf, it's Shanahan's. I don't know. I'm not a football nerd, so I don't know, but it's
The,
something
the
about
coach, the
yeah,
coach's
the
coaching
coach of the
tactics.
49ers. He's got like
Yeah.
he's too aggressive or whatever, and then this, maybe the players are too old. They're older on the 49ers. Those kind of things, and then for people that are not necessarily steeped in football world, but are maybe more on the wellness side, you get, I think you pointed out earlier, like Cipro is used a lot as an antibiotic. And especially when they're dealing with like MRSA and these, and so that itself can degrade to collagen, and even just the stress of working out a lot and not getting adequate repair time. There's oxidative stress. I don't remember if it's upregulate or downregulate something called MPP that is critical factor in collagen synthesis. So there's a lot of these factors. It's never one thing, and I think unfortunately in the wellness world, it's like people are like it's the one thing, and like I the way I wrote this article, it sounded like I was saying it's the one thing, but that's not my MO. Like this is just something that was overlooked that I thought needed some looking at.
Yeah, and to maybe like there's a lot there. Let's quickly explain circadian rhythm, like presuming there's someone who's completely new to this
Okay.
science. Maybe you can explain that for them, and I'll color in anything I think's relevant.
Sure. I mean, I think circadian rhythm, I think a lot of people kind of intuitively understand. Like we got artificial light in what, 1890 or something like that. Before that, it was candles, fire, propane, whatever, oil lamps. And so we basically evolved in an environment where light came from the sun and the moon. And so our system adapted to the signals from the changing quality of the light throughout the day. And the most important signal is right at sunrise. So I mentioned the rainbow earlier. You got that big red at the top and then the violet at the bottom. The blue frequencies change the most throughout the day. The red is pretty stable. Right at sunrise, you go from a little blue to a ton of blue. And that blue spike, as we call it, sets your circadian clock in your brain. Basically tells your body's processes what time of the day it is and gets you ready for the morning, kicking out some hormones and so on and so forth. And then on the other side, when the sun goes down, the blue goes away, and that allows melatonin to be secreted from your pineal gland. And then there's a lot of processes that are waiting for that melatonin signal to upregulate, downregulate, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we disrupt that process, the very simple high level overview is we're pumping out the wrong hormones at the wrong time of day and not getting the right hormones at the right time of day. And it causes chaos in your system.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone wants to dive into this again from actually a sports point of view, I recorded with Eric Novak, MD, who's
Cool.
he's a orthopedic surgeon and a trauma surgeon in Arizona, and he himself noted and basically said a lot of what you said, well, specifically with respect to light and potentially things like Bluetooth headphones and the rest. This was more than a year ago. To explain this explosion of soft tissue injuries that he's seeing in athletes. And yeah, well explained. I mean, the circadian rhythm is something that, again, was solar light, the sunlight, and nocturnal darkness was the norm for the whole duration of life on Earth. And only since the late 1800s, as you said, we've found a way of lighting up our nighttime. And I think more recently, found a way of everyone staying indoors under artificial light that's a fraction. It's 10% of the natural solar spectrum. So people aren't recovering, and then they're not sending the correct signals, and they're not recovering properly, as you said. And key to the discussion about sports injuries is the degree to which collagen is made, remodeled, and repaired. And as you highlight, that is regulated on a 24-hour rhythm. So if these athletes are going to bed at 11 p.m. and they're having between sunset and bedtime 4 hours of blue light, they're potentially delaying their onset of that melatonin, potentially at least by that much.
Yeah. Yep.
Did you have anything else to add about I guess circadian or like alternative explanations? Because if we just focus on the science here, this is probably a lot of new concepts to a lot of people, especially in the traditional sports medicine field.
Yeah, I do think it's really important to emphasize the circadian stuff because this is something that is completely mainstream now. And if you go to PubMed and you look up circadian disruption and basically any issue, you're going to find dozens of papers. And specifically for this collagen synthesis one, though, there's some really good literature on it, and I dug through it. It's not actually that hard to understand. You don't have to know the quantum mechanics or the biophysics. There's an enzyme called lysyl oxidase that's on a circadian timing mechanism. And then I mentioned MPP earlier. I don't remember what it stands for, but
is that matrix metalloproteinase?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not a biochemist, so like I read the stuff and then it's like, okay, I got the idea, and it goes away. But it's the fibroblasts are also on a circadian mechanism. So you're getting the effects of the basic downgrading of the mitochondrial function in those fibroblasts are very, very mitochondrial dense. But then on the other side, you're disrupting the timing, and so it's kind of like a double whammy. And then you got the lysyl oxidase factor, which is critical in giving that kind of cross-linking that is required for the collagen to become just like the sturdy, stretchy rope, like cable, like material. And when it's not cross-linked and the fibroblasts are producing incorrectly, you get a different type of collagen that's thicker, but not as stretchy, and it's more prone to breaking when under high loads.
Yeah, so it's compromised. It's the body's making a trade off in the production of these factors to do the best under adverse conditions. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
that sounds plausible and to me. Uh,
there was an ex 49er who tweeted, he's like, just for what it's worth, I never had plantar fasciitis in my life except for when I was in the 49ers. And plantar fasciitis, you probably can explain. There's like an acute one and a long term one, so there probably is a different technical term, but basically long term plantar inflammation issues is characterized by a switch, I think, from collagen type 3 to type 1 or whichever direction. And it's documented in the literature. It's not controversial at all.
yeah, and again, very, very, very interesting. And I think the other point, again, when we talked offline, we're talking about this idea of a causal model, and in disease, especially chronic disease development and thinking long term about what causes it's no one's proposing necessarily like a univariate model. We're always implying that there's component, it's often just a layering of component causes, and the number of causes or the proportion of the contribution of different causes is going to be different for each individual
Mm-hmm.
because of genetic susceptibilities and because of
Exactly.
their lifestyles. So I guess what we're suggesting and what you're suggesting, Peter, is that not necessarily that there's no other factor contributing to these non-contact injuries, but if the athletes are doing everything else wrong and they're having chronic circadian rhythm disruption and they're then potentially being next to this substation is the icing on the cake. It's the cherry on top. That
Yep.
And this mitochondrial dysfunction in these really high end athletes is simply showing up as Achilles rupture, ACL ruptures.
Yep. A high ankle syndesmosis, I think, is the one that the 49ers, it's just like their signature injury. And it's where the tendon from the ankle connects to like one of the shin bones or something like that. And I think it's also important to note that these are non-linear effects. So even everything else that you mentioned, you can't predict in one person what's going to happen. It's just not possible.
It reminds me of some of the research that we're seeing in out of astronauts, and
Mm.
they go into the space station, they get bombarded by an environment that is profoundly inhospitable to mitochondrial function. They're under visible only light that's deprived of infrared. They are in a hypomagnetic field. They lack gravity. That they're actually getting also exposed to some cosmic radiation, but
Mhm.
it ages them, and some of them the fittest people, because the bar to become an astronaut physically is so high. Some of these people are even coming back insulin resistant and showing
Mm.
signs of metabolic dysfunction, and it makes me think that these athletes, they are the cream of the physically fit and high performance humans, and that this is potentially their body's way of manifesting that mitochondrial dysfunction. And if it were anyone else, I don't know, maybe we need to do a cohort study looking at the support staff.
Yeah.
Is the rate of diabetes higher in
Right.
in the support 49ers support staff? Like, let's
Yeah.
compare that, because
Yeah.
that might show some signal for other flavors of mitochondrial dysfunction manifesting in different people.
I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, there's so many with mitochondrial dysfunction. There's so many different ways that it can manifest. Like we're focused on the collagen issue because of the injuries, but you mentioned diabetes. Maybe there's more heart disease. Maybe there's more depression, insomnia. Like it could be. It just depends on like where your weak points are in the DNA, the mitochondrial DNA that you got from your mom, and uh, we could I could easily see doing a cluster study on all the different cohorts that spend all their time at this substation or at the facilities next to the substation So if somebody want, like, it's such a good opportunity to do some science here, and
Absolutely.
it's such a bummer that it's just been debunked by the mainstream. Like, but the 49ers have a lot of money in it, so maybe when the dust settles a little bit, they can focus on it when people aren't criticizing them anymore.
Yeah, and look, I'm interested in metabolic disease, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, because I'm a primary care physician. Like,
Mm.
this is the biggest problem that that is hitting populations, and this is how it manifests in people who live sedentary lifestyles, that eat ultra processed foods, that have chronic circadian rhythm disruption, but they're not high performance athletes. And these, I'm sure maybe if they started doing the degree of exercise, they might be getting these injuries. And you do see it. You see dads. I mean, I've patients. The late 40s dad at indoor soccer, ruptured ACL. Like, that's, I think I've had two of those.
Okay, yeah.
So I mean, it does happen. But to your point, the mitochondrial function manifests differently depending on what the other environmental inputs are. And I think the other key point here is that, um, and this might explain to some degree why people have been reluctant to it, or it's been somewhat opaque in terms of attributing causation to EMF exposure, which is how heterogeneous
Hmm.
the phenotype of mitochondrial dysfunction is. And
Yep.
obviously, the heart, the brain, the retina have some of the most amount dense, the highest density of mitochondria. But because of this idiosyncratic response, I think sometimes you do get such a variation, and that can sometimes distort the picture.
I think that's a really
From
interesting point. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
just from an epidemiological point of view.
Right. And even from a lab point of view, I think it's a really important point because if you go back to the 70s, Dr. Andrew Marino, he was the biophysicist who worked with Dr. Robert O. Becker, who was, for the listeners who don't know, just really important scientist in figuring out how electricity and EMS affect our body. They spent Marino spent decades studying this issue and fighting. He got his law degree so he could fight, be his own representative in fighting the power utilities that wanted to put high voltage lines over people's homes in upstate New York. And because the effects are nonlinear, they would do a study on rats, and they do like 3 generations, and one of them would just be shriveled up and weak after 3 generations, and one of them would actually be stronger. And then they could do other things to like add other external stressors like the size of the cage and all these factors to kind of manipulate the science. And then you just average it out and like, well, this one got bigger and this one got smaller, so the net effect is zero, and so we're not going to study this anymore. And it's unfortunate because the fact that these effects are nonlinear is really important. It's kind of the most important factor in understanding why there's such a widespread difference in health effects from it. And that thing itself has been used to suppress the science.
Yeah, and look, I'm actually optimistic. I think it's going to take, and maybe the for this 49ers issue and your analysis of it ends up being the kind of mark in the sand, the fork in the road that brings more widespread attention to the role of non-native EMF exposure in human health. Because I really believe it's actually going to take something this big or this important to get people to consider this as a health hazard. Because up till now there hasn't been a lot of movement, and unless you are in some of these, I would say, extremely niche health or scientific circles, you'd have absolutely no idea. And people almost want to believe that it's a nothing burger because the implications are pretty profound in terms
Mm-hmm.
of exposures, environmental exposures that they're suffering from. But you don't have to look far to see the rates of obesity. I mean, premature graying and balding. I really think
Mm-hmm.
that compared to previous generations. If you compare men to their fathers, like
Yeah.
that's another canary in the coal
For
mine
sure.
for mitochondrial dysfunction. And
Yep.
I think as a society, we're accelerating our use of radio frequency radiation. We're accelerating our use of devices and the AC power grid. We're only going to be more exposed to these EMFs, and I think it's time that we collectively take our head out of the sand and start asking serious scientific questions about what this is doing to our physiology. And I think when people do those investigations, they're going to come back to mitochondrial dysfunction, and they're going to come back to mitochondrial health and a lot of the topics that we've discussed today.
Yeah, and I just want to add to your point about it being kind of you call it like a fork in the road. I think of it as an inflection point. I don't know where it's going to lead, but I can tell you that mostly I've done media, like NFL sports related media. And I did the show called Pardon My Take, which is part of an organization called Barstool Sports, which is a very mainstream, funny sports program. And I cannot tell you how much feedback I've got from just like normal NFL loving people just saying, "Oh my God, this I I've always kind of known this stuff wasn't good for me. And I couldn't explain why, and I don't even need to explain why. I just know." And they want to know what they can do to kind of mitigate, and they're asking about blue blockers for their circadian stuff. And like, just for context, I got deep into this stuff 2 years ago. Like, I've I've been deep into it since I worked for a wireless networking company 8 years ago. But 2 years ago, I decided this is going to be my focus for my career for a while. And for the most part, if I mentioned it to someone, I'd maybe, if I was lucky, I wouldn't get an eye roll. Maybe just get kind of baffled, that sort of thing. Or I'd explain something, and then the person I was hanging out would leave, and they put their like, after I'm just telling them everything about it, they'd be like, okay, put their Bluetooth headset in and listen to their podcast again. It's like it just wasn't resonating, to the point where I was like, I'm not even going to bother talking about it anymore beyond just my platform and my work, because I don't want to bother people. And then just like overnight, everybody I know is interested in it and they're receptive to it. So I don't know where it's going to go on the science side of things, but there's definitely a bit of like kind of a collective awakening happening right now. It's pretty exciting.
Amazing. Well, any last points you want to add before we wrap up in terms of the article series, or points you want to make, or anything else that you want to share?
Yeah, I just want to say it's really like it's interesting that so that first tweet in that thread got 22 million views. And then you can't really count how many it's gotten in the media and all over social media and stuff. But I did a four-part essay series, and the second and the third essays were the one that had the meat of the mechanisms. Last time I checked, the second and the third had about 8,000 views. So that's a stark contrast between the number of people who are discussing this issue as if they understand it and the people who have actually read those essays. So I would just encourage anybody, if you're curious, just read the essays, and you can even comment or email me, and I tend to respond. And as long as you're engaging with me in good faith, I will answer honestly and do my best to help you.
Yeah, and look, the whole reason why we're in this, I mean, you're in this, as you said in the beginning, it's for the players to help
Exactly.
to help the players,
Yeah.
and I'm a similar motive to help patients. So
Yeah.
the motives aren't the motives aren't misaligned here. We're just simply trying to spread a message that we think is relevant and significant for people's health.
Yeah.
Sweet. So very good. I think people love this conversation, Peter. So thanks for joining us. Where can hand us off to your Substack or your social media? How can people interact with you and contact you?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing is just go to sunlightislife.com, and that's basically a little sunlight circadian app that I created that's free right now, and you just sign up and you can learn. It's got a lot of education materials and tools that you can use, and that'll have links to my social media. I'm living_energy at X, and my Substack is Peter Anthony Cowan. I should have, like, if I was any good at marketing, I would have used the same handle for every platform, but I'm not, so I didn't. But it's all there, and you can find my email address if you want to ask questions. And yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, living injury. I think that's the reality that some of these 49ers players are actually going
Right.
through.
Yeah.
A bit of a Freudian slip there. Thank you very
Yeah.
much, Peter. And yeah, great to talk to you. And yeah, thanks for spreading this important message.
Thanks for having me, Max. I really enjoyed it.